History, as they say, is written by the victors. But what happens when the narrative is skewed, leaving out crucial details and perpetuating harmful myths? This is precisely the case with the traditional American school narrative surrounding the slave trade. Textbooks often present a simplified version of events, implying that the slave trade was solely an American invention. This couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is far more complex and deeply unsettling. The transatlantic slave trade was a global enterprise, a network of greed and oppression that spanned continents. To fully grasp the origins of this barbaric system, we must delve deeper, beyond the sanitized versions presented in classrooms. We must confront the uncomfortable truth that the slave trade was not born on American soil. It's easy to lay the blame solely at the feet of American colonists, but this simplification ignores the larger historical context. The slave trade was a pre-existing institution, already flourishing under European powers long before the first slave ships arrived on American shores. To understand the slave trade's true origins, we must turn our attention across the Atlantic, to the heart of European colonialism. The seeds of the transatlantic slave trade were sown in the fertile ground of European colonialism. Driven by an insatiable thirst for wealth and power, European powers set their sights on the New World. They craved the riches the Americas promised: sugar, tobacco, cotton. But these crops required vast labor forces to cultivate them, labor forces that Europe, with its dwindling population, couldn't provide. Enter Africa. European traders, already familiar with the African continent through existing trade routes, saw an opportunity, a horrific opportunity to exploit. They turned to the already existing practice of slavery within certain African societies, manipulating it to serve their own avarice. These European powers, fueled by their sense of entitlement and racial superiority, deemed Africans as less than human, justifying their enslavement. The stage was set for one of the most horrific chapters in human history. European ships laden with manufactured goods sailed towards the African coast. There they would trade their wares for human beings, individuals torn from their homes and families, their lives irrevocably altered. These enslaved Africans were then subjected to the brutal journey across the Atlantic, crammed into the nightmarish holds of slave ships. The Middle Passage, as it was known, remains a chilling testament to human cruelty. Disease, starvation, and despair were constant companions. Millions perished during this horrific journey, their bodies tossed overboard, swallowed by the waves. Those who survived the journey faced a grim fate, a life of forced labor, stripped of their freedom and dignity. While it is crucial to acknowledge Europe's central role in establishing and perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade, we must also examine the African side of this complex and tragic history. The traditional narrative often paints a picture of a homogeneous Africa, a continent united in its victimhood. However, the reality is far more nuanced. It's true that European powers forcefully captured many Africans, tearing them away from their homes and communities. However, it's also a painful truth that some African rulers and traders actively participated in the slave trade. Motivated by a complex interplay of factors, including economic gain, political power, and existing intertribal conflicts, these African leaders engaged in the selling of slaves to European traders. This participation in the slave trade was not a monolithic decision across the continent. Some African kingdoms and communities resisted the trade fiercely, fighting back against European encroachment and protecting their people. Others found themselves caught in a web of economic dependency and political pressure, forced to make impossible choices in the face of European aggression. The internal slave trade within Africa further complicates the narrative. Slavery existed in Africa before the arrival of Europeans, often taking different forms than the chattel slavery practiced in the Americas. However, the transatlantic slave trade, with its insatiable demand for human cargo, drastically intensified and transformed these existing practices. The influx of European goods and weapons upset traditional power balances and fueled intertribal conflicts, leading to an increase in the enslavement of Africans by other Africans. The complexities of the African side of the slave trade might be better understood by drawing a parallel, however uncomfortable, with America's own history. During the Revolutionary War, American colonists, vastly outmatched by the British Army, resorted to guerrilla warfare tactics. They utilized surprise attacks, sabotage, and knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, often relying on local support and intelligence. This strategy, while effective in securing American independence, also involved alliances and collaborations that could be considered morally ambiguous. Some colonists, driven by self-preservation or opportunism, sided with the British, providing them with supplies, shelter, and information about their fellow Americans. This historical comparison is not meant to equate the actions of African leaders who participated in the slave trade with those of American colonists who collaborated with the British. It's meant to illustrate the complex realities of power dynamics, survival, and moral compromise that often arise in times of conflict and exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade was not a simple transaction between two parties. It was a multifaceted tragedy, fueled by greed, racism, and the ruthless pursuit of power. Understanding its full complexity requires acknowledging the uncomfortable truths on both sides of the Atlantic. It's easy to get lost in the vastness of the transatlantic slave trade, to become numb to the sheer scale of human suffering it represents. Statistics, while important for grasping the magnitude of this atrocity, can sometimes obscure the individual lives tragically cut short or forever altered. Behind each number there was a human being, a mother torn from her children, a son ripped from his father's embrace, a young girl whose dreams were shattered on the shores of a foreign land. They were artists, musicians, storytellers, healers, individuals with their own unique talents, hopes, and aspirations, all stolen from them. The trauma inflicted by the slave trade didn't end with the abolition of this barbaric system. Its legacy continues to reverberate through generations, manifesting in systemic racism, economic disparities, and the ongoing fight for equality. The scars of this horrific chapter in human history run deep, a constant reminder of the devastating consequences of greed, hatred, and the dehumanization of others. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a dark period in human history. It was a deliberate system built on the backs of millions of enslaved Africans. It laid the foundation for centuries of oppression, discrimination, and inequality. Even after its abolition, the ramifications of this inhuman system continued to echo, shaping societies and perpetuating racial divides. The wealth accumulated through the slave trade fueled the rise of Western powers, while the forced labor of Africans contributed significantly to the economic development of the Americas. However, this prosperity came at an immeasurable human cost. The legacy of the slave trade is intricately woven into the fabric of our world. It's a stark reminder of the fragility of human rights and the capacity for cruelty that exists within us. It's a call to action, a reminder that we must remain vigilant in the face of injustice and fight tirelessly for a more equitable and just world. The traditional narrative surrounding the slave trade, with its oversimplifications and omissions, does a grave disservice to the truth. It prevents us from fully understanding the complexities of this horrific chapter in human history and hinders our ability to learn from the past. Reclaiming history means confronting the uncomfortable truths, acknowledging the complicity of various actors, and giving voice to the silenced narratives of those who endured the horrors of the slave trade. It's about moving beyond simplistic explanations and embracing the messiness, the contradictions, and the uncomfortable realities that shaped this period. It's time to shed light on the full story of the slave trade, to teach it in all its complexity and brutality. Only by acknowledging the past in its entirety can we hope to learn from it, to dismantle the systems of oppression that persist today, and to create a future where such atrocities are never repeated.